My daughter-in-law kissed my son goodbye that morning, told him she'd be back in 3 days, and rolled her suitcase out the front door like she did every few weeks for one of her business trips. I watched her taillights disappear down the driveway the way I had 100 times before, feeling nothing but the same tired ache I'd carried for 6 years. Then I turned around to check on my son. The boy who hadn't taken a single step since a highway accident, left him paralyzed, and found him standing in the kitchen doorway, steady on his own 2 feet, looking at me like he'd been waiting years to say what came next. My name is Frank Delacroix. I'm 68 years old, and until 6 years ago I thought I understood exactly what the rest of my life was going to look like. Quiet mornings on my porch in Georgia, a garden I'd finally have time to tend properly, maybe some fishing trips with my son Daniel once he'd built the career he'd worked so hard for. Daniel was a structural engineer, sharp and steady, the kind of son who called just to check in, not because he needed something. I was proud of him in the deep, quiet way a father gets proud when he watches his child become someone he genuinely respects, not just someone he loves out of obligation. Then on a rainy October evening, a delivery truck lost control on the interstate and crossed the median doing 65 miles an hour, and my son's life split cleanly into a before and an after. He survived. That was the miracle everyone kept telling me to be grateful for in the weeks that followed, and I was grateful genuinely, even as I sat in that hospital hallway, watching doctors deliver the rest of the news in the careful, rehearsed tones people use when they've had to say something devastating too many times. Complete spinal injury at the T10 level. Paralysis from the waist down. Permanent, they said, though they were careful never to use that exact word, preferring instead phrases like, "We don't currently expect further recovery." The kind of language that leaves a little door open, I think mostly so families don't fall apart completely in the room. I sold my share of the hardware store I'd run for 30 years and moved into the guest room of Daniel's house without either of us really discussing it as a decision. It was simply what needed to happen. His wife Emily was working full-time at a marketing firm downtown, and someone needed to be there for the physical therapy appointments, the medication schedules, the 100 small indignities that come with a body that no longer does what you tell it to do. I didn't mind. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters for you to understand I wasn't a resentful old man counting the cost of what caregiving took from me. I love my son. I would have done far more than I did. Emily in those early years seemed like exactly the kind of partner you'd want your child to have in a crisis like that. She was attentive in front of company, always making sure visitors saw her adjusting Daniel's blanket or bringing him water before he asked. She managed his medical appointments with an efficiency that impressed the doctors. She handled the insurance claims, the disability paperwork, the endless phone calls with adjusters that would have driven me to distraction. On paper, and in the eyes of everyone who knew our family from the outside, Emily was devoted. But I want to tell you about the small things because I've had a long time now to sit with them, and I understand now what I only half noticed then. Emily never let me see the full medical files. Whenever I asked to look over something myself, a discharge summary, a physical therapy report, she'd tell me she'd already filed it, or that the doctor's office was slow sending copies always, some reasonable-sounding excuse that taken one at a time never seemed worth pressing. She changed Daniel's rehabilitation specialist 3 times over those 6 years, each time citing some dissatisfaction with the previous doctor's approach, though Daniel himself never seemed to have complaints of his own. She discouraged his old college friends from visiting gently at first. "He's tired today. Maybe next week would be better." Until eventually those friends simply stop calling the way people do when they get the message a household doesn't want them around anymore, and she controlled every dollar. Daniel's disability settlement, the family trust his grandmother had left him, all of it flowed through accounts Emily managed with Daniel's name attached, but his hands never quite on the wheel. I told myself more times than I'm proud of that I was simply an old man who didn't like change, uncomfortable watching a younger woman run a household with an efficiency I didn't fully understand. I told myself Emily loved me, that grief and stress make people controlling sometimes, that I should be grateful someone was managing all of this so competently instead of resenting how completely she'd taken it over. I want you to understand that I believed that mostly for 6 long years. That morning started like 100 others. Emily came down the stairs already dressed for travel, rolling a suitcase behind her, telling us both in the same breezy tone she always used that she had to fly to Chicago for 3 days to meet with a client. She kissed Daniel on the forehead, told him she'd call that evening, and walked out the front door toward the car, waiting to take her to the airport. I stood at the kitchen window the way I always did, watching her taillights disappear down our long gravel driveway, feeling the same dull, familiar tiredness I'd carried every day since that October evening 6 years earlier. Then I turned around to check on my son the same way I'd checked on him 10,000 mornings before, expecting to find him exactly where he always was. He wasn't in his chair. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame for balance, but standing fully steadily on legs that 6 years of doctors had told us would never hold his weight again. My coffee mug slipped from my fingers and shattered against the tile floor, and neither of us moved to clean it up. Daniel looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something fierce and exhausted and urgent all at once, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Dad," he said, "we don't have much time." I stood frozen in that kitchen, broken coffee mug scattered across the tile at my feet, staring at my son standing upright in front of me, like something out of a dream I hadn't let myself have in years. Part of me wanted to rush toward him, wrap my arms around him, weep the kind of relieved, joyful tears a father is supposed to weep when his child walks again. But something in Daniel's face stopped me cold. There was no joy in his expression, no wonder at his own recovery. There was only a hard, focused urgency, and underneath it, something that looked almost like shame. "Sit down, Dad," he said, and I did. Though it was Daniel who pulled out the kitchen chair for me instead of the other way around, a small reversal that somehow made the whole moment feel even more surreal. "How long?" I finally managed to ask. "How long have you been able to do this?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, his jaw working the way it used to when he was a boy trying to figure out how to admit to something he'd broken. "Almost a year," he said. The words landed like a physical blow. A year. 365 days of watching my son maneuver his wheelchair through doorways, of helping him transfer in and out of the car, of listening to him thank Emily for her patience during physical therapy sessions. I now understood must have been some kind of performance. All of it for an entire year, unnecessary. "Daniel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you hide this from me?" He sat down across from me at that kitchen table, the same table we'd eaten 1,000 meals at over the past 6 years, and he told me everything in the careful, methodical way he'd always explained complicated engineering problems to me when he was younger, laying out each piece before building toward the conclusion, like he needed me to understand the whole structure before I could accept what it was holding up. About 14 months ago, he told me he'd been sitting in his wheelchair near the top of the stairs waiting for Emily to bring down a laundry basket when he heard her voice through the cracked door of what used to be his home office, now converted at Emily's insistence into what she called her management space for handling his finances and paperwork. She was on the phone, her voice low but not quite low enough, and what he heard stopped his heart in his chest. "As long as he stays in that chair," she'd said with a coldness Daniel described as unlike anything he'd ever heard from her before, "everything belongs to me." He didn't move. He didn't confront her. He told me that in that moment some instinct older than trust, older than love, told him to stay perfectly still and listen. And what he heard over the following minutes of that call reshaped everything he thought he understood about his marriage. Emily was talking to someone about accounts, about a trust, about timelines. Casual, business-like language that Daniel, with his engineer's mind, immediately recognized didn't belong in an innocent conversation. That night alone in his room after Emily had gone to sleep, Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He tried to move his legs, really tried, focusing every ounce of concentration he had on the simple act of flexing his toes. And something happened. Not much. A twitch barely perceptible, but something. Over the following months, Daniel told me he began secretly working with a physical therapist he found on his own, paying in cash through a friend from his old engineering firm who helped him set up an account Emily wouldn't see, doing exercises late at night after Emily had gone to bed in the garage with the door locked, teaching his body to do what 6 years of doctors had told him it would never do again. Slowly, painfully, his legs came back to him. He didn't tell Emily. He didn't tell me. Instead, he hired a private investigator, a careful, discreet man named Robert Chen, who Daniel had found through an old college friend, and began quietly gathering information about exactly what his wife had been doing with the family's finances for the past 6 years. What Robert found devastated me almost as much as it clearly still devastated Daniel to say out loud. Emily had been systematically siphoning money from the family trust his grandmother had established, nearly $3 million over 6 years funneled through a series of accounts and shell entities designed to look on paper like legitimate medical and household expenses. But that wasn't the worst of it. Robert had also uncovered documents suggesting Emily had been consulting with an attorney about having Daniel declared legally incompetent using his paralysis and what she described in emails as his deteriorating mental state. A complete fabrication, Daniel assured me, his voice tight with anger, as he said it as grounds to gain full legal and financial control over everything. The house. Daniel's remaining shares in his old engineering firm. All of it. She's been planning to take everything, Dad. Daniel said, his hands gripping the edge of the table hard enough that his knuckles went white. Not eventually. Soon. Robert found paperwork suggesting she was planning to file the competency petition within the next few months. I sat there absorbing all of it, feeling something cold and furious settle into my chest, replacing the tired grief I'd carried for 6 years with something sharper, more purposeful. I thought about every dismissed request to see Daniel's medical files, every friend Emily had quietly discouraged from visiting, every account I'd never been allowed to look at closely. 6 years of small, reasonable-sounding refusals that I'd talked myself out of questioning. And underneath every single one of them apparently had been exactly the kind of calculated deception I'd never once let myself seriously consider. I need your help, Dad, Daniel said, looking at me with an intensity that reminded me powerfully of the boy who used to bring me broken bicycle chains and ask me to help him figure out how they worked. Everything Robert and I have gathered, it's at a house Emily doesn't know I know about. We need to go there. Today. While she thinks she has 3 more days before anyone suspects anything, we took my truck instead of Daniel's car, an old habit of caution I didn't fully understand yet, but that Daniel insisted on, along with driving a roundabout route that avoided the main highway leading out of our town. Watching my son navigate directions from the passenger seat with the same steady confidence he'd always had, legs working the floorboard, as naturally as if 6 years had never happened. I kept catching myself stealing glances at him, like I needed to confirm over and over that this wasn't some fever dream I'd wake up from. How did you find this place? I asked as we merged onto a state highway heading north, away from everything familiar. Robert found it about 4 months ago, Daniel said, eyes fixed on the road ahead. It's registered under a company called Meridian Holdings LLC. Took him weeks to trace it back to Emily because she'd buried the ownership under 2 other shell companies first. But it's hers, Dad. Has been for almost 3 years. 2 hours later, we pulled up a long, unmarked gravel drive to a modest ranch house set back from the road, surrounded by enough trees that you'd never notice it from the highway unless you were specifically looking for it. Daniel had a key. Robert had apparently managed to obtain a copy through means Daniel didn't elaborate on, and I didn't ask about, and we let ourselves in through a side door into a house that felt immediately wrong in a way I struggled to articulate. It was too clean, too impersonal, like a place designed to be visited rather than lived in. The main room contained a large desk with a computer, a fireproof filing cabinet, and against the far wall a steel safe roughly the size of a small refrigerator, its dial gleaming under the room's single overhead light. Daniel moved toward it with a confidence that told me this wasn't his first visit here. Robert got the combination a few weeks ago, he said, already turning the dial with careful practiced motions. Cost me more than I want to think about, but it was worth every dollar. The safe opened with a heavy metallic sound that seemed to echo through the empty house, and what was inside made my stomach turn over slowly, like the floor had shifted beneath me. Stacks of cash banded in amounts I didn't want to guess at. A manila folder full of contracts I didn't yet understand. 2 passports, one under Emily's real name, another under a name I'd never heard before, both with her photograph inside. And beneath all of it, a thick accordion folder stuffed with medical documents. Daniel pulled that folder out first, his hands visibly shaking now, in a way they hadn't been in the car, and spread its contents across the desk. I watched my son's face as he read through pages he'd apparently already seen once before, but clearly hadn't fully absorbed the horror of, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone flat and quiet in a way that frightened me more than if he'd been shouting. "Dad," he said, "look at this." I picked up the top document, a series of clinical notes from Dr. Marcus Reinhold, the rehabilitation specialist Emily had switched Daniel to nearly 3 years ago, the second of the 3 doctors he'd cycled through over the course of his recovery. The notes described in careful professional medical language a patient showing minimal to no improvement and limited long-term prognosis for ambulatory function assessments dated across a span of 18 months. But clipped to the back of that same folder was something else entirely. A separate set of notes in the same doctor's handwriting describing a patient clearly Daniel referenced by initials and case number that matched, showing significant and accelerating neurological recovery and strong candidacy for continued ambulatory rehabilitation. These notes were dated the exact same period as the ones claiming no improvement at all. I looked up at Daniel, unable to fully process what I was reading. 2 sets of records, I said slowly, for the same time period. He was being paid, Daniel said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. There's a wire transfer record in that folder too, $40,000 from one of Emily's Shell accounts to Dr. Reinholdt's personal account, dated right around when he started documenting the false version. He was paid to lie about my condition, Dad, to make sure that on paper I was never getting better, even while he could clearly see with his own eyes that I was. I sat down heavily in the desk chair, the weight of what we were uncovering pressing down on me physically like the air in that too-clean room had suddenly grown thick and difficult to breathe. 6 years. 6 years of watching my son endure physical therapy sessions that I now understood must have felt increasingly pointless to him, even as his body was quietly, secretly improving, beyond what any of the official records ever acknowledged. 6 years of a corrupted doctor filing false reports to keep my son legally medically classified as someone who would never walk again, not because his body demanded it, but because someone had paid for that outcome to remain permanently on paper. She bribed a doctor. I said, mostly to myself, trying to make the words feel real by saying them out loud. She bribed a doctor to keep you in that chair. Not just to keep me in the chair, Daniel said quietly, pulling out another document from deeper in the folder, his expression darkening further as he read it. Dad, this is an email exchange between Emily and an attorney about the incompetency petition. Look at the date. I took the printed email from his hands and felt something cold settle permanently into my chest as I read it. The email was dated nearly 2 years ago, long before the timeline I'd assumed, long before whatever recent urgency Daniel had described. This hadn't been a plan Emily developed recently out of impatience. This had been the design from very early on, patient and methodical, built slowly over years with the careful precision of someone who understood that the best lies are the ones given enough time to calcify into simple, unquestioned truth. I thought of every dinner Emily had cooked for us with apparent care, every gentle correction she'd offered when I suggested a different doctor or a second opinion, every soft, reasonable justification for why things had to be handled her way. All of it apparently had been the patient architecture of a woman quietly building a cage around my son for 6 long years, brick by brick, lie by careful lie, while I sat beside her at that kitchen table, thinking I was watching devotion. There's more, Daniel said quietly, sliding a final folder across the desk toward me, his hand trembling slightly as he did. Dad, I need you to sit with this one for a minute. It's about the accident. I looked at that folder sitting on the desk between us, and something in the way Daniel had said it carefully, deliberately, like a man setting down something fragile, made my hands go cold before I'd even opened it. I'd spent 6 years believing I understood exactly what had happened on that rainy October evening. A delivery truck, a slick highway, a failed brake system, simple mechanical bad luck that had reshaped my son's entire life in the space of 4 seconds. I opened that folder believing I was about to read confirmation of a tragedy. I was not prepared for what I actually found. The first documents were financial records, bank statements, and credit card bills belonging to Emily, dated in the months leading up to Daniel's accident. And even without fully understanding everything I was looking at, the pattern was impossible to miss. Large cash withdrawals, repeated charges to something called Meridian Card Room, a series of payments to a payday lending company that had apparently extended Emily nearly $40,000 in short-term loans in the 4 months before the accident. She was gambling, Daniel said quietly, watching my face as I worked through the numbers. Robert traced it back. Poker, mostly at a card room 2 towns over. She'd been going for almost a year before the accident, losing far more than she was winning, and by that October, she owed money to people who don't send polite reminder letters when payments are late. I set the bank statements down slowly, my mind already moving toward a conclusion I didn't want to reach, and Daniel, watching me arrive there, nodded slowly before I even said anything. There's a second folder, he said, Emails between Emily and someone named Trevor Marsh. I didn't recognize the name either, not until Robert dug deeper. He worked for the trucking company whose vehicle hit me that night. Maintenance department. My stomach dropped somewhere near the floor of that too-clean house. I pulled the folder toward me and began reading, and with every page the careful, ordinary version of my son's accident that I'd carried in my chest for 6 years came apart a little further, replaced by something far darker and far more deliberate. The emails between Emily and Trevor Marsh spanned roughly 6 weeks before the accident, initially framed as innocuous, old acquaintances reconnecting Trevor, apparently having dated Emily briefly in college before she met Daniel. But the tone shifted quickly, growing intimate in ways that made my chest ache, reading them evidence of an affair I'd never once suspected during all those years I'd lived under the same roof, watching what I believed was a devoted marriage. And then, buried in an email dated 11 days before the accident, was a passage that made the room around me seem to tilt slightly. Trevor, the email read, "I need this handled before the 15th. The life insurance and the trust both need him, disabled, not gone. I've told you this already. If he dies, everything gets tied up in probate for years, and his father's name is still on half of it. I need him in a chair permanently where he can't fight me on anything financially. Can you make the brakes fail without it looking intentional?" I read that paragraph 4 times before the words fully registered, and when they finally did, I felt something break loose inside my chest that I don't think I'll ever fully be able to describe, a grief so total and so betraying that it felt almost physical, like something had been surgically removed from me without anesthesia. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad luck or a tired truck driver or a mechanical failure nobody could have anticipated. My son's paralysis, 6 years of his life reduced to a wheelchair, 6 years of physical pain and quiet grief, and the slow erosion of the future he'd been building for himself. All of it had been deliberately engineered by his own wife, with the help of a man who apparently still loved her enough or feared her enough to sabotage a truck's braking system in exchange for whatever she'd promised him. "She didn't want to kill you," I said slowly, my voice barely functioning. "She wanted you disabled, controllable." "That's what the emails suggest," Daniel said, and I could hear underneath his carefully controlled voice the same devastation I was feeling myself, compounded by the fact that he'd apparently been sitting with this exact revelation for weeks, already working through his own version of this exact grief alone, before he'd found a way to bring me into it. Trevor Marsh worked in the maintenance yard where that truck was serviced 2 days before the accident. Robert found records showing he clocked in for a shift that shouldn't have had him anywhere near that particular vehicle. The official accident report attributed the brake failure to a manufacturing defect in a valve component. Robert had an independent mechanic review the original inspection photos. He says the damage pattern is inconsistent with a manufacturing defect. It's consistent with deliberate tampering. I sat in that chair for a long time after that, unable to speak, turning the entire architecture of the past 6 years over in my mind and watching it collapse into something almost unrecognizable. Every physical therapy session, I'd driven Daniel to believing we were fighting against simple bad luck. Every night I'd sat beside his bed in the early months, telling him that terrible things sometimes just happen to good people, that there was no reason behind it. Nothing to be angry at except the universe's indifference. All of it had been a lie sitting on top of a much older, much colder lie, a woman who had calculated with apparently very little hesitation that her husband's permanent disability was worth more to her than his life, his mobility, or the truth. "I've had weeks to sit with this, Dad," Daniel said quietly, watching me absorb what had taken him considerably longer to process himself. "I know how it feels right now. I felt exactly the same thing the night Robert first showed me these emails. I wanted to drive straight to wherever Emily was and confront her right there. No plan, no evidence gathering, nothing but rage. I'm glad I didn't. I think if I had, she would have found a way to spin it to make it look like I was the unstable one. The paranoid husband imagining conspiracies. We needed all of this first, every piece of it. I nodded slowly, though. Nodding felt like an enormously inadequate response to what we just uncovered. I thought about 6 years of blaming myself quietly in the private hours of the night for not being a better caretaker, for not somehow making Daniel's recovery happen faster through sheer force of love and attention. 6 years of misplaced guilt sitting on top of a truth that had nothing to do with my inadequacy and everything to do with a woman I'd welcomed into our family. Fed at our table, trusted with my son's entire future. What do we do now? I asked, though some part of me already suspected I knew the answer, watching the same hard-focused determination settle back over my son's face that I'd first seen in our kitchen that morning. Now, Daniel said, gathering the documents carefully back into their folders, we make sure she loses everything the same way she tried to take everything from me. Not with violence, not the way she tried to do it to me. With the truth laid out so completely and so undeniably that there's nowhere left for her to hide. We didn't rush it, even though every instinct in my body wanted to. I understood, sitting in that hidden house with the weight of what we'd discovered pressing down on both of us, why Daniel had spent weeks moving carefully instead of confronting Emily the moment he'd learned the truth. Rage wants speed. Justice. I was learning from my son that day requires patience. I'm not going to destroy her, Dad, Daniel said, as we packed copies of everything into a box to take with us, careful to leave the originals exactly where we'd found them, so Emily would have no idea we'd been there. I'm going to let the truth do it. Over the following 2 days, working out of a motel room 3 towns over, so Emily wouldn't find any trace of our activity if she checked the house cameras remotely, Daniel and I built the case that would finally end 6 years of lies. Robert Chen came to meet us in person, a quiet, precise man in his 50s, who spoke the way I imagine a good surgeon speaks: calm, exact, entirely focused on the work in front of him. Together, the 3 of us organized everything into a structure that would leave absolutely no room for doubt or misinterpretation. The falsified medical records side by side showing Dr. Reinholdt's 2 contradictory sets of notes, the wire transfers proving his payment, the emails between Emily and Trevor Marsh detailing both the affair and the sabotage, the financial records showing 6 years of systematic embezzlement from Daniel's trust, and the attorney correspondence outlining her plan to have Daniel declared legally incompetent. Daniel called a lawyer his old firm had used for corporate matters, a sharp, unflinching attorney named Vivian Castellanos, who, after reviewing the first 20 minutes of what we'd assembled, sat back in her chair and told us plainly that what we had wasn't just grounds for divorce and asset recovery. It was grounds for criminal prosecution, attempted murder, insurance fraud, medical fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, charges serious enough that she recommended we bring in federal investigators alongside local police, given the scope of the financial crimes involved. We spent that second night making the calls that mattered most. Vivian contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division, directly, given the interstate nature of the shell companies and the trust fund manipulation. Robert delivered a formal report to the local police department, detailing the sabotage evidence, coordinating with them on how to properly secure the hidden house and its contents as evidence, before Emily had any chance to discover we'd been there. It was, I'll admit, strange and unsettling to watch my quiet engineer son transform over those 2 days into someone capable of orchestrating something this methodical and this complete. But watching him work, I understood that this wasn't cruelty. This was 6 years of stolen time converted finally into something purposeful. Emily's flight back from Chicago was scheduled to land Thursday afternoon. Daniel insisted on being home before her, sitting exactly where she'd expect to find him, in the wheelchair he no longer needed, but that had become, over these final days, something closer to a prop in a performance he was determined to finish on his own terms. I understood, watching him settle back into that chair with a strange, hollow expression on his face, that this was its own kind of grief, reclaiming the physical freedom he'd fought so hard to hide, even temporarily, in service of finishing what he'd started. I remember the specific sound of her key in the front door that afternoon, a sound I'd heard 10,000 times over 6 years, without ever once feeling the way I felt hearing it that day. A strange, sick anticipation, like standing at the top of a staircase. I already knew I was about to fall down, except this time I understood exactly what waited at the bottom. Emily walked in, rolling her suitcase behind her, already talking before she'd even fully entered the room, something about her flight being delayed and how exhausted she was, the same easy, practiced warmth in her voice that I now understood I'd been fundamentally misreading for 6 years. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Daniel. He was standing. I watched every muscle in Emily's face shift in the space of about 2 seconds. Confusion first, then something that looked almost like fear, and finally a kind of dawning, horrified comprehension as she took in not just Daniel standing upright in the middle of our living room, but the careful, controlled expression on his face, and the fact that I was standing beside him rather than fussing over some emergency. Her suitcase slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a heavy thud that seemed to echo through the entire house. She reached out to steady herself against the doorframe, her face going pale in a way that 6 years ago I would have rushed toward with concern. That day I simply watched. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely functioning. What is—" "Surprised," Daniel said, and the single word carried more weight than I think I've ever heard a word carry in my life. 6 years of pain and betrayal, and carefully controlled fury, delivered in a tone that was somehow almost gentle. Emily's eyes moved rapidly between Daniel and me, clearly trying to construct some explanation some way, to reframe what she was seeing into something she could still manage. This is wonderful," she stammered, taking a hesitant step forward, her hands reaching out toward him with what might have looked to an outside observer who didn't know what we knew like genuine joy. "Why didn't you tell me, Daniel? This is a miracle. I know about Dr. Reinhold," Daniel said quietly, and I watched every ounce of color drain from Emily's face as those words landed. "I know about the money you've been taking from the trust. I know about the competency petition you were preparing to file. And Emily," his voice caught just slightly, the only crack in his composure through the entire confrontation. "I know about Trevor. I know what the two of you did to that truck." Emily's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She looked in that moment like a woman watching 6 years of careful construction collapse in the space of a single sentence. And some small, complicated part of me almost felt sorry for her, the way you might feel sorry for anyone watching everything they'd built crumble at once, before I remembered sharply and completely exactly what that construction had cost my son, and reminded myself firmly that sympathy had no place here. That's when we heard the second car pull into the driveway, tires crunching against gravel, followed by the low, distinctive static crackle of a police radio. Emily's head turned sharply toward the window, and whatever fragile composure she'd been holding on to finally completely broke. The trial took nearly 8 months to reach months during which I watched Emily's public composure shift through several distinct phases, each one more calculated than the last. In the early hearings, she tried grief, sitting beside her attorney with red-rimmed eyes, dabbing at her face with a tissue whenever the prosecution presented evidence, playing the part of a devoted wife blindsided by accusations she couldn't possibly understand. When that approach began visibly failing to move the judge, she shifted to something closer to righteous indignation, insisting through her attorney that she was the true victim here. A woman who had sacrificed 6 years of her life caring for a disabled husband, now facing what her lawyer described with a straight face as a coordinated smear campaign orchestrated by a bitter father-in-law and a husband experiencing some kind of psychological break. I sat through every single hearing. I wanted to be there for all of it, not because I needed to see Emily punished, though I won't pretend some part of me didn't want exactly that, but because I owed it to Daniel to witness every piece of what he'd carried alone for so long, to make sure he never again had to face any part of this by himself. The evidence, when the prosecution finally began presenting it in full, left almost no room for the narrative Emily's attorney had been trying to construct. The audio recordings Robert had helped Daniel capture over those final months, including devastatingly a conversation between Emily and Trevor Marsh, recorded through a device Daniel had planted in her office weeks before their confrontation, in which the two of them discussed with a casualness that made the courtroom go dead silent. How relieved they were that the accident had worked out, played through the courtroom speakers while Emily stared straight ahead, her face rigid. The financial records came next, laid out methodically by forensic accountants who walked the jury through 6 years of systematic theft from Daniel's trust, nearly $3 million redirected through shell companies with a precision that suggested the lead accountant testified, a level of sophistication typically seen in professional fraud, not casual opportunism. Dr. Reinhold, facing his own charges by that point, had already agreed to a plea deal that included testifying against Emily, confirming under oath that he'd been paid to falsify Daniel's medical records specifically to support what he described as her stated goal of maintaining legal and financial control over her husband's affairs. But it was Daniel's own testimony on the 4th day of the trial that I think I'll remember most clearly for the rest of my life. He sat in that witness box, calm and steady in a way that surprised even me, and told the entire courtroom the truth I'd only learned myself a few months earlier, that he'd spent nearly the last year of his marriage secretly regaining the use of his legs, hiding his recovery from his own wife. Sleeping in a locked garage at night to train a body that 6 years of doctors had told him would never work again, all because he'd overheard entirely by accident the exact moment his wife revealed what she actually valued about him. "I want the court to understand something," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly through that silent room, and I watched several jurors lean forward slightly to hear him better. "For 6 years, I believe my wife was the one good thing that survived my accident. I built my entire recovery around gratitude for her patience, her devotion, everything I thought she was sacrificing to care for me. Finding out none of that was real, that my disability wasn't an accident she endured, but a plan she engineered that broke something in me that I don't know will ever fully heal. But I want to be clear about why I pretended to still be paralyzed for nearly a year after I discovered the truth. It wasn't about revenge for its own sake. It was because I understood, watching her operate for 6 years, that if I confronted her without absolute proof, she would find a way to spin it to make herself the victim, the same way her attorney has tried to do throughout this entire trial. I needed the truth to be undeniable. I needed it to speak for itself, because I'd learned the hard way that my wife was very, very good at making lies sound like love. I was called to testify the following day, and I remember Vivian asking me gently whether I wanted to express any anger toward Emily directly to the court. I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered, because I wanted to say something true, not something that simply satisfied the moment's appetite for righteous fury. "I'm not angry in the way people probably expect me to be," I told the courtroom, looking briefly at Emily, who kept her eyes fixed somewhere on the table in front of her, refusing to meet mine. "I spent 6 years believing this woman loved my son. I fed her at my table. I trusted her with everything that mattered to our family. What I've learned through this process is something I think anyone watching this trial should sit with, whatever their own family looks like. Greed doesn't destroy families overnight. It destroys them one small, reasonable-sounding lie at a time, until you look up one day and realize the person you trusted most has been quietly building a cage around everyone you love." The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. Emily was convicted on all counts: attempted murder, insurance fraud, medical fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, and sentenced several weeks later to 22 years in federal prison, with the judge noting in her sentencing remarks that the calculated, sustained nature of the deception involved represented one of the most methodically cruel betrayals of trust this court has encountered. Trevor Marsh received a separate sentence of 14 years for his role in the sabotage. Dr. Reinhold lost his medical license permanently and received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. I watched Emily led out of that courtroom in handcuffs, and I felt mostly exhausted, the particular exhaustion that comes after carrying something enormous for far too long, and finally being allowed to set it down. Daniel sat beside me, quiet, his hand finding mine the way it used to when he was a small boy frightened by thunderstorms, and neither of us said much of anything on the drive home. Some things I've learned don't need to be narrated in the moment. They just need to be survived together. Part 7. Walking into a new life. The months after the trial passed slower than I expected, in the particular way that healing always seems to move slower than the damage that made it necessary. Daniel underwent one final surgery that winter, a procedure his new physical therapy team doctors we'd chosen together this time. Doctors I sat in every single appointment with, insisting on seeing every report myself, described as addressing the last remaining nerve damage that had been slowing his full recovery. It wasn't dramatic, not the way the trial had been, not the way that morning in the kitchen had been. It was quiet, technical, the unglamorous final chapter of a much longer story. But I remember the first time I watched him run. It was early spring, maybe 4 months after the surgery, and Daniel had been building his strength, gradually walking longer distances each week with the same disciplined patience he'd once used to hide his recovery from Emily, except now there was nothing left to hide. I was sitting on the back porch of my house, the same porch I'd once imagined spending my quiet retirement years on, before everything changed, when I heard footsteps coming around the side of the yard faster than a walk. And I looked up to see my son running across the grass toward me, arms already open, a huge unguarded grin on his face that I hadn't seen in longer than I could remember. He nearly knocked me out of my chair with the force of that hug, and I held on to him the way I imagine I held on to him as a small boy, before either of us had any idea what the coming years would ask of us. I don't think I've ever cried the way I cried in that moment, Not even during the darkest weeks after his accident. Not even sitting through the worst days of that trial. This was different. This was relief so complete it felt almost like a second birth. Watching my son run and laugh and hold on to me with the full strength of two working legs and a heart that despite everything had somehow remained fundamentally good. We didn't sell the hidden house once the legal proceedings were finally settled, and it reverted along with everything else Emily had stolen back into Daniel's control. Instead, over the following year, we did something with it that felt to both of us like the only fitting response to everything that house had once represented. We renovated it completely top to bottom and turned it into a small nonprofit center for people recovering from spinal cord injuries, a place offering physical therapy, financial counseling for families navigating disability claims, and trust management, and something Daniel insisted on, personally overseeing a peer support program, connecting newly injured patients with people like himself, who understood exactly what it felt like to have your entire sense of your own future upended in a single afternoon. Daniel named it the Second Step Foundation. He told me once, sitting in his office there, on a quiet afternoon a few months after it opened, that he'd chosen the name because of something he'd been thinking about. Ever since that morning, I found him standing in our kitchen doorway. "I stood up twice in my life, Dad," he said, looking out the window at a young man in the courtyard below, working carefully through a set of parallel bars, with a physical therapist beside him, an image that had become achingly familiar to both of us over the years. Once from that wheelchair, learning to trust my own body again after everyone told me it was permanently broken. And once from the lies that kept me sitting in it far longer than my body ever actually required. I don't know which one took more courage, honestly. Some days I think the second one was harder. I think about that conversation often now, months later, sitting on my porch in the evenings, watching the sun go down over a life that looks almost nothing like the one I imagined during those long, quiet years of caregiving, and nothing at all like the one I feared during those darkest weeks after we discovered the truth. Daniel remarried last spring to a woman named Sarah. He met through the foundation's board, a occupational therapist who I've watched treat both my son and every patient who comes through that building with the same clear-eyed, uncomplicated kindness that I understand now I should have recognized as rare, precious, and entirely different from whatever performance Emily had been running for 6 long years. I don't compare the two women often. I try not to. But I notice things now that I never used to notice before, small, honest gestures that don't ask for anything in return. And I find myself grateful every single day for having learned the difference the hard way. I think about that morning in the kitchen more than I probably should, the coffee mug shattering against the tile, my son standing in that doorway, telling me we didn't have much time. I've come to understand that everything that followed the hidden house, the devastating discovery about the accident, the trial, all of it was never really about revenge in the way I might have described it to you at the beginning of this story. It was about something quieter, and I think, more important than that, it was about a father and a son finally fully trusting each other again, piece by piece, the same patient way Daniel once taught his own legs to work again in a locked garage in the middle of the night, believing against everything the world had told him that recovery was still possible. If there's anything I hope you take from our story, it's this. Sometimes revenge isn't about making someone suffer. Sometimes it's about surviving long enough to let the truth speak for itself clearly and completely until there's nowhere left for a lie to hide. My son stood up twice in his life, once from a wheelchair, and once from the lies that kept him there far longer than his body ever needed to. I wanted to share this with you because I know so many families out there are carrying something they can't quite name, some quiet unease. They've talked themselves out of questioning the same way I did for 6 long years. If any part of this story reached you tonight, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what it stirred up in you. Leave a comment below and let me know. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you every day, so please subscribe so you don't miss a single moment like this one. Let's keep this journey going together.